Welcome everybody, and especially to our two online speakers, Sarah Ichioka and Elisa Iturbe, who are speaking at the moment, I think from Rotterdam, Sarah, and from New York, Elisa. And I'd also like to thank Jeremy Till, who's going to be joining the panel from the room. Before we start, I'd just like to give a huge word of thanks to Ro Spankie, who is an assistant head of school in the School of Architecture and Cities, and Diana Periton, who's a visiting lecturer in the school, for all the effort that they've put into conceptualizing and organizing this event on behalf of the Architecture and Cities Climate Action Task Force. So thanks so much. It's been a mega effort, and I'm sure it's going to be a really enjoyable event. Architecture Acts, a climate performance in 3 parts, was conceptualized as a collective performance to question how architecture and architectural education is responding to the current climate crisis. We take the word climate after writer Christine Sharp to be total. Climate is not just the meteorological data that drives the weather forecasts, but climate is at once climatic, ecological, social, economic, and political. Our school's climate action strategy has taken the position that climate change is not a technical problem to be solved, but rather an opportunity to rethink and reset human planetary relations. And I think this is what brings us into conversation with the 3 speakers who we've brought together today. We seek to find ways to move beyond sustainability paradigms which leave economic growth, accumulation, and global inequality and nature-culture binaries unquestioned. And here, even the UN sustainability goals fall into that trap. Instead, we seek to promote regenerative and redistributive paradigms that operate within our planet's ecological limits. And we're trying to think what this means for how we educate architects. Today, we have brought together 3 leading thinkers on these questions to discuss their approaches to them. And I'm just quickly going to introduce the 3 speakers before I hand over to Sarah and then Elisa and then Jeremy to give their presentations or their talks. Sarah Ichioka is an urbanist, strategist, curator, and writer. Now based in Singapore, she holds degrees from Yale University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. And there must be something about Yale that's produced these 2 extraordinary women that we're going to hear from today. Sarah leads Desire Lines, a strategic consultancy for environmental, cultural, and social impact initiatives. And her latest book, which is what brought us into conversation, Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency, co-authored with Michael Paulin, proposes a bold set of regenerative design principles for addressing compound environmental and social crises. Elisa Iturbe is a critic at the Yale School of Architecture, where she teaches design and runs a seminar titled The City and Carbon Modernity, which explores the spatial expression of our dominant energy paradigm in both urban and architectural form. Elisa also coordinates the dual degree program between the Yale School of Architecture and the Yale School of the Environment, from which she herself graduated. I came across Elisa's work when I attended the launch of Log 47, which is this book here, which she edited, titled Log Overcoming Carbon Form in New York in 2019. Elisa is also co-founder of Outside Development, a design and research practice that considers race, class, labor, climate, and capitalism, alongside form, proportion, and the production of the urban fabric. And our final speaker will be Jeremy Till, who is head of Central St. Martin's and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts in London. Jeremy was previously Dean of Architecture in the Built Environment at this university, which is where we first came into contact, and before that, the head of architecture at the University of Sheffield. Jeremy is a prolific writer of polemical and widely read books, such as Architecture Depends and The Design of Scarcity. With Titania Schneider, he currently leads the research project, Architecture After Architecture, Spatial Practice in the Face of the Climate Emergency, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the German Research Foundation. Jeremy is also a trustee of the New Economics Foundation. Okay, so after that, I'd like to hand over to Sarah. Daniel's going to sort out the technology, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you clearly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that fantastic grounding introduction. Good afternoon from Amsterdam, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you virtually and to reconnect with friends and colleagues in London, and a new friend, a new colleague in New York, Elisa. Thanks so much, Lindsay, for the invitation to contribute. So since I understand that Elisa's reference text for today will focus on the physical form of the built environment, I thought I'd take another tack, looking at how we can examine the social and cultural systems and frames that need to be actively redesigned in order to enable our transition to the regenerative and redistributive society that Lindsay referenced. And because we've been convened today by a University of Architecture, and with I guess I'm the odd one out and not being affiliated with a School of Architecture, and in the wake of a shocking but shockingly unexpected report about the degenerative and whatever the opposite of redistributive culture at one of the UK's leading architecture schools, I thought it would be interesting to focus in particular on facets of architectural education and architectural culture, and how those, and then maybe in discussion we can talk about how those interface with extractive models of building and construction. So to do this, I'll be reading some passages from Flourish, Michael Pollan's, and my General Manifesto for Regenerative Design and Development. And Michael wants to send all of you his apologies. He's currently away with his family on a well-earned holiday. So in Flourish, which I think some in the audience may have read, we offer 5 paradigm shifts that we believe are fundamental to changing the way we design, build, and inhabit our built environments. For those who might already have a copy of the book, the passages are from chapter 4, which is entitled Symbiogenesis, Mutualism, Citizen Activism, and Public Luxury. So let's dive in. What do we gain and what do we lose from a culture of competition in our built environments? Let's start by examining the origins of some of the stories that we tell ourselves about competition in society more broadly. It's hard to overstate the extent to which aspects of Charles Darwin's 19th century theory of evolution continue to influence the way people in Western industrial societies view the world. And I can say from the perspective of Singapore, you could also say Eastern industrial societies. Co-developed with his fellow naturalist, Alfred Wallace, Darwin's theory of natural selection described a process by which groups of organisms change over long periods of time due to individual variability and the passing down of heritable traits that are better adapted to a particular environment. His On the Origin of Species provoked public debate and struck a chord with his contemporaries who sought to transpose its biological ideas to social theory. In his Principles of Biology, Herbert Spencer, who was in his time an influential polymath, reframed natural selection as survival of the fittest and proposed to apply this concept to the study of culture and politics, resulting most notably in the negative legacy of social Darwinism and its associations with scientific racism and the discouragement of government policies of social welfare. If we need to rethink humankind's position in relation to nature, it's interesting to note that this rephrasing also rhetorically separates individual subjects, the quote fittest, who compete to survive from the holistic framework of quote nature. Darwin subsequently adopted Spencer's term in his own writings about evolution, and survival of the fittest as a phrase became lodged in our common usage. Now, more than 5 human generations after the Victorians, this gripping story of a zero-sum struggle of individuals and groups in genetic competition with one another still permeates much of our common understanding about the science of evolution and how we employ it as a metaphor for human behaviors. Mainstream discussions of capitalism and technology, for example, still reference, quote, Darwinian processes of disruption and creative destruction, terms which are usually employed with positive connotations. Yet in the intervening years, the substance of both scientific and philosophical thinking have themselves evolved in ways that resonate with some older forms of knowledge. So we, Michael and I, join with others who believe that competition is one of the legacy paradigms that is inhibiting our society's regenerative transformation. Our views about this new paradigm are inspired by many great thinkers, but perhaps most significantly by the work of the evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis and the environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht. For the purposes of today's remarks, I'll just be focusing on Lynn Margulis. Margulis was the biologist who collaborated with James Lovelock to scientifically substantiate the Gaia theory, which posits that planet Earth is a complex and self-regulating system. She made another very important contribution to scientific and public understanding of the role that processes of symbiogenesis have played in the evolution of life forms through her combination of breakthrough research and clear communication of complex concepts. So what is symbiogenesis? Margulis explained the important distinction between that evolutionary term and the ecological concept of symbiosis as follows. Symbiosis refers to the living together of organisms of different species. Endosymbiosis, a topological condition, is a kind of symbiosis where one partner lives inside of another. Symbioses usually, if not always, have environmentally contingent outcomes. Symbiosis, not an evolutionary process per se, refers to the physiological, temporal, or topological associations with environmentally determined fates. Symbiogenesis, however, implies the appearance of new tissues, new organs, physiologies, or other new features that result from protracted symbiotic associations. So essentially, it's the idea of becoming something together in the form of making something new symbiotically, if that makes sense. It was highly controversial at the time when it was first published, but subsequent scientific research has proven it to be more the case than not. We now know that the boundaries of individual plants and animals are nowhere near as distinct as Western science once imagined them to be. In a survey dedicated to the memory of Margulis, Scott Gilbert and co-authors review the great extent to which symbiosis is becoming a core principle of contemporary biology and replacing this essentialist conception of individuality with systems-based inquiries that lead us into directions that transcend the self, non-self, subject, object dichotomies that have characterized Western thought. So we then go on in the book to talk about implications for governance, development, city planning, etc. But I wanted to focus in the remaining minutes on its implications for design culture. In order to design our places, cities, and infrastructure in the new symbiogenetic paradigm, we also need to transform our professional norms. In our view, Michael's and my view, this means a transition from the old role of designer as the lone critic consumer to one of collaborative conductor citizen. And I think this probably has resonance with a lot of the work that Jeremy and Tatiana assemble in their wonderful ongoing research. Too much of built environment culture appears to be stuck in the old tropes of mutation and survival of the fittest. When designers are conditioned to approach the world as critics, we look for things to compete with or complain about, rather than to contribute to or help to change. This begins within the often brutal culture of universities, where students are expected to spend most of their time in the studio, pay fees disproportionate to their future earning potential, and wear their sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, even though we know it's fundamentally destructive to their mental and physical health. As educator Robert Mull observes of architecture schools, the power structures of a society that has failed so many, including students, are woven in rather than resisted. Look at the words: the unit master, the crypt, the jury, the marketplace, all ways of dignifying values that are based on competition, power, and inequality. This means a culture where students, their teachers, and schools compete for advantage, resulting in long hours, mistrust, insecurity, and overproduction. Add to this fees, debt, fear of debt, long courses, and the need to work in addition to studying, and you have a toxic mix. These problems are structural, with education nested within professional practice, itself nested within society. And Mull notes that architectural culture is currently ripe for exploitation, as architectural education, like practice, immediately becomes distracted by internal competition and individual advantage. Incapable of collective action, we are the softest targets for predators, including aggressive clients and the government. When only the wealthy can afford to pay steep university fees and pitch for free, as many clients unfortunately expect, this drives inequality within the profession. This degenerative distraction finds form in the standard industry structures of the design competition to win new work, or at least exposure, and its cousin, the design award, often a shallowly concealed marketing exercise whose ranks seem to proliferate each year in search of sponsorship money. In theory, these competitive formats attract new talents and new ideas to emerge into public view. In practice, they enforce a working culture that is extractive and exploitative, a continuation of sleep deprivation culture, which transfers much of the cost of new ideas to the designer, who is often asked to pitch for free against stacked odds of success and encourages individuals to see one another as rivals. And we go on, but I think I would like to hand across to Elisa. I mean, maybe I will just read one final passage that looks at positive examples. Just allow me maybe 1 more minute. Fortunately, we can also find ample green shoots of the regenerative alternative, symbiogenetic approaches to systems of design culture. Promising models of education include Mull's own global free unit, in which each student picks a real site and associated community for which they have a close personal affinity, writes their own brief and contract of service for the final project. The Rural Studio in Alabama puts students to work designing facilities and service to low-income communities who they live amongst. And the students learn far more about architecture and society than they would in a purely speculative studio. And all the hard work has a tangible outcome whose benefits far outlast the duration of their period of study. And we also go on to describe attractive alternatives to competitions and awards. But I want to make sure that we leave enough time for discussion and find a new basis for regenerative architectural, educational, and critical practices in this conversation. So I think I'll pass over to Elisa now.
Thanks, Sarah. So I have a few slides, so I'm just going to share my screen. Does that look okay? Okay. So Good morning from New York, and thank you and congratulations to Sarah and Michael for this book. And I'm so happy to be here with everyone today. And I'll start by saying that I really enjoyed reading the book, and I think we share many important points of departure. And perhaps one of the most important for me is simply the concept that we can either continue as it is, and the system gives way through collapse and famine and migration and resource wars, all the things that we know that are coming, or the system gives way because we allow it to, because we force it to when we design it to. And so either way, climate change is an ending point of some kind, and we're at a crossroads, and at that crossroads, architecture is an important force for either maintaining or changing the status quo. So I think we share that as a point of departure. And it's also I'd like to talk about today, because I think that thinking through this moment of transition, we have to ask what architecture's role is going to be. And so Sarah and Michael, I think, do a really great job of laying down a broad view of change and of transition and what is at stake. And so as architects, we have to really ask, how might that, all of this oncoming change, this giving way perhaps, be a means of building something new rather than another form of collapse if things are changing as quickly as they are. And so for me, one of the biggest questions is, moment, we have to make a distinction between what is currently collapsing but shouldn't be, and what is not collapsing but should be. This is a moment of giving way. And so one of my questions is, how can architecture participate in the death of carbon modernity? And how can that death be generative and productive, and bring new change that is good rather than simply be destructive? But I think we have to think about that giving way, and understand that there are also all these things that we are letting go. And to put it in the words of the author Roy Scranton, how can we learn to die as a civilization so that we can move on, learning how to die in order to survive? And to me, that's what the death of carbon modernity means. And to me, that also means that before we propose new things, we can't simply do that without looking backwards and having a confrontation with everything, the legacy of everything that we've inherited. So you can see on the screen, I have an image from the Ville Dieu by Le Corbusier. These are spatial and formal patterns proposed in order to give form to an industrial society. And this is the spatial and the cultural legacy in architecture that we continue to build on. So in the book, I really love that Sarah and Michael used Donella Meadows' leverage points as an introduction. And she's someone who is theorizing how change comes about. And Sarah and Michael point out that one of the most important ones, they're kind of working at the top of the hierarchy, which I really appreciate. And one of the most important is how to change the mindset or the paradigm out of which the system arises. And I have to confess that when I started writing about carbon form, when Log 47 first came out, I had not come across Meadows' leverage points yet. But I really feel that I share this notion of starting with that point of departure, and specifically asking, what is this kind of mindset that has led us to continue to produce the built environment in this way? Where does this paradigm come from? And if we don't have that confrontation, how can we really know that something we are proposing is actually new, or simply new instruments for existing practices? And to me, that's a really important distinction. And I think that in much of environmental discourse in architecture, we see new instruments for existing practices rather than things that are introducing a shift to the paradigm. So in that light, I want to discuss the concept of carbon form, which is a term that I've been using to try and make sense of the relationship between, on one hand, urban and architectural form, and on the other, our current energy paradigm, which is based on fossil fuels. So at its most simple, carbon form can be defined as the spatial paradigm that emerges from carbon-intensive energy paradigm. And so another way of saying this basically is that if we look at the longer history of energy transition, we can see that with every energy transition that we've had, there has been a corresponding revolution in both social and built form. So if we start with hunter-gatherer society, which had a relatively light architectural footprint, then we move into sedentary agricultural societies, and at this moment you get the rise of towns and cities. And then you get a totally new spatial order that emerges with the rise of fossil fuels, one that fundamentally reconfigures the form of the city. And also architectural typologies. So of course we get warehouses and factories and worker housing in the early industrial period, leading into office towers and apartment buildings and skyscrapers and suburbs and the distribution networks, and of course the concrete landscapes of carbon mobility or petromobility. So this, in my mind, is the spatial paradigm of carbon energy and what I like to call carbon form. And I think it's very important to name it and to identify it. First, because we have to recognize carbon form as the spatial building blocks of fossil capitalism. We have to understand that these things are instrumentalized by a lot of these capitalist processes and industrial processes. And second, because we have to recognize as architects that these are the formal and spatial configurations that architects and builders are replicating over and over and over again. So a confrontation with that, to me, is fundamental in order to understand what might be forward. I also want to draw a distinction between what I would call two modalities of carbon form, and I like to refer to them as active and passive. And what I mean by active carbon form is simply that there comes a moment in time where I think that carbon form is activated as an explicit architectural project. And I think you can see that shift from passive to active carbon form in the early 20th century with the rise of modernism. And then after modernism declines, we get another shift from active back to passive when we move into postmodernism. And I'm going to argue that we're still in a state of passive carbon form. But so let me explain that a little bit better. So starting with this first shift into active carbon form, in the modern moment, modernist architects were looking back at the chaos that was wrought on cities by industry in the 19th century. So this is a quote from Le Corbusier from the Athens Charter, where he's saying that people have failed to understand the rules of urban development. He's talking about how the countryside has been emptied. He's looking at all these issues, and he ends this paragraph by saying, "Nothing was done to safeguard man. The result is catastrophic. It is a bitter fruit of 100 years of the undirected development of the machine." So we have this kind of scathing view of the 19th century city, but I think it's really important here that he points out that it's the undirected development of the machine, not the machine itself is a problem. And of course, we know that Le Corbusier was really into machines, of course, but he is not the only one, right? If we look at a quote also from Hilbersheimer in his book, The New City, I'm getting a notification that my internet is unstable. Can you hear me? Yes. So Hilbersheimer is, a little bit more, I think he has a little bit more of a sophisticated social take in some senses. And he's also, though, siding with this position, right? And he's saying that the machine and the steadily advancing specialization it made possible created an almost unlimited capacity for production. This capacity has been wrongly used and wastefully used and never fully used at all. This is the source of our economic disorder. So, when we think about modernism, often we think about this disdain for the past, but, it really not a wholesale disdain for anything that had come before. And in fact, there are many examples of modernists being very excited by ancient architecture and ancient cities. So what a lot of these treatises reflect is specifically a critique of the 19th century city, which could not accommodate essentially the brave new world of a fossil economy. And so I think it's important to look at all of these questions through the lens of carbon modernity and to perhaps argue that early 20th century architecture was not necessarily a historical rupture in the way that we like to think about it, or at least as a modernist, there's the rupture and everything before is a separate phase, but actually modernism can be an inflection point within the development of carbon form because the architects were identifying a dissonance between the form of the historical city, these kind of pre-carbon fabrics, and that was in tension with the logic of a fossil fuel economy, which is based on growth and the movement of people and products and speed and all of these things that really arise with this influx of dense and abundant energy into our social and economic and productive systems. So in other words, the modernists, I feel, rather than proposing a kind of full break with all of history, we're looking at this early industrial economy and seeing that it's trying to function within the constraints of a pre-carbon spatial form. And they're looking at how that doesn't work. And so seeing that disjunction, they break the city open to adjust it to the demands of this new economy in order to make it work. And they make it work by giving it form. The modern urbanist project was not a critique of industry. It was an exercise in giving it form. And so that's how we might think of carbon form, as an explicit actual project. But what's interesting is that the cities that the modernists were reacting to, I would say, are also carbon form, the early industrial city, right? So this goes back to the other modality of carbon form, which is passive carbon form. And I think that the concept of passive carbon form is simply to recognize that these configurations, or certain configurations of space and form, can still result directly from a system of energy capture without particular design intent, right? So Victorian London is an easy example, or perhaps, excuse me, the spectacle of early industrial infrastructure. But also I think that we have shifted back to passive carbon form today, because these questions of production for the latter half of the 20th century were kind of displaced out of architectural discourse in a particular way as different concerns emerged within postmodernism and digital design, et cetera. So I would argue carbon form is also prevalent today, and you see it in the gleaming spectacle of most contemporary architecture that I think easily fits the bill of carbon form, or you also see it in the spectacle of contemporary domestic luxury, or in something not so designed, such as suburban patterns, which are only possible because of petromobility and because of the ready availability of dense and abundant energy. So these may not be an explicit architectural project for the kind of restructuring of social form as modernism was. In both of these cases, all of these cases I just showed, carbon form is resultant. But I think that they're recognizable spatial structures nonetheless. And as architects, I think we can begin to ask how we can intervene upon them. And what I'd like to perhaps posit as we segue into discussion is that maybe at this point in time, we can once again have what I would call a kind of active project, but this time against carbon modernity, against carbon form. But I think that there's a remaining question, which is, what do we give form to? The modernists had this advantage, so to speak, that the energy transition that they were looking at had already happened and had been evolving already for 100 years. And they simply arrived on this to give it order, essentially, to give it form. In our case, our energy transition has not necessarily happened. But my hope is that if we can understand this correlation between energy and form, and we can understand the sort of power that architects had in that time to actively try and overturn an existing world order. In this case, it was an agrarian world order that they were trying to overturn in favor of an industrial world order. Perhaps we can begin to ask questions as to how we participate in the next overturning that needs to happen now. Now, of course, that really leaves the question of what do we give form to, and what are the values, and what are the ideals, and what is this new social form that we're trying to give form to. I don't think that that necessarily comes from architecture, and we have to work in tandem with these developing ideas of alternatives, which is why I think Sarah and Michael's book is so important. And so I think I'm ending here just by returning full circle to what both Sarah and Lindsay brought up already, that these elements of cultural and social change are inseparable from how we have to think about design. And so I think that there's, or perhaps we can say that there are two aspects of this. One is thinking about design as a practice and thinking of all these questions that Sarah has brought up about the conditions in which we work and who do we work for and what are our cultures of work and of labor, and how do we ourselves kind of push ourselves further into the mindset of producing and reifying carbon modernity through our practice and the structure of our profession and the fact that we, tend to work for private developers who have profit motives, et cetera. So there are all these questions about how we restructure, how we work. But then I think there's also a question of the built environment itself. And that's I think the idea of carbon farm is more focused on that, simply because that these spatial configurations are ones that I think we tend to take for granted. And often it's about applying technological fixes on top of these configurations. So, if we fill this with electric cars and top all these buildings with solar panels, that spatial configuration remains undisturbed, and yet it emerged directly out of trying to reorganize society in favor of first an industrial economy and then consumer economy. So I think we have a lot to take on, and this is not an easy moment to be an architect. But I hope that perhaps today in the discussion, we can, at least debate some of the ways forward. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much to Sarah and Elisa. I'm going to now hand over to Jeremy for a response and an input, and then we'll open it for questions from or discussion from the floor. Thanks, Jeremy.
Am I on? Thank you.
Yes.
I'm so glad that this discussion is happening. I'm sort of getting to the state when if an institution isn't putting climate at the center of what it does, then it is in a form of denial or with it complicity. So I think that actually having these debates is incredibly important. I've been giving a lecture recently around the world, which is based on what I'm going to talk about. And one of the things that really annoys me at the end of the lecture is when people say, God, that was really provocative, Jeremy. Because that also comes with it saying it's not really serious. It's just Jeremy strutting up and down and being Jeremy again. And I think that, and so I picked Lindsay up saying my books are polemic. They might have been polemic at the time, but blimey, they suddenly seem really prescient in the way that some of the things that Sarah was talking about in terms of competition, we were talking about some time ago. So thank you to those two presentations, but also to the amazing work that goes behind them. I think these are both really, really important projects, and they very much chime with the work that we're doing in this research project, which is a collective called MOLD. And so I'll do Architecture 101, Architecture After Architecture 101, 1 minute on how we got £500,000. So the premise is that architecture, as we know it, as Elise has talked about so well, is tied into the tenets of the modern project, the tenets of progress, of growth, of order, of reason, and in particular, man's dominion over nature. So that's the first premise. The second premise is the climate emergency makes the tenets of the modern project completely unsustainable. In fact, it presents a fatal flaw to them. And therefore, if it presents a fatal threat to the tenets of the modern project, it also, as Elisa talked about, presents a fatal threat to the tenets of architecture as we know it. So the question we asked ourselves is, what is architecture after architecture? And we're only halfway through, so I don't have a book and I don't have an article to give you as a definitive answer. But what I think that many of the arguments that in that 1 minute elevator pitch are also made much more profoundly in Sarah and Michael's book. And I think in particular, this sense, what I think is amazing about the book is the bravery of moving beyond the miserable, and I think in the end, kind of in their death throes, tropes of sustainability into a completely new way of seeing the world, which is beyond limits, beyond the kind of the sense of growth which we're addicted to at the moment, and takes into account a whole new set of paradigms. And I think in that is a book everyone should be reading. I'm trying to find, what have I done with the clipper? Doesn't really matter. I can do it. Oh, here it is. So these are just background. I'm not really going to speak to them. So the regenerative project, I think, is at heart an optimistic one. And the question maybe we can talk about afterwards is whether that optimism can be fulfilled or whether it is going to be constrained by some of the current systems. And in terms of, these are some posters that we did for a march through London from Mould, which set out some of the arguments as posters. And if you then turn to Elisa's article, which I think should become one of these kind of texts of which everyone should be reading. I think it's an amazing piece of work. The text when I was a student here, not quite in this room, but yeah, more or less in this room, was Aldo Rossi. And I remember seeing, Aldo Rossi came to speak to us, and I remember seeing him out there when it's still a terrace, looking at a cup of 1980s English coffee with a mixture of complete bafflement and complete disdain. Anyway, but I think this article is a really important piece of work, and particularly when you put it together, and it was written before Barnabas Corder's book Architecture came out. But if you put the two together, it makes such a profound statement about the state of architecture as we know it in relation to the carbon state that you can't ignore it. And I think that this kind of the sense of complicity of the architectural project within the project of the carbon state is really beautifully kind of explained within her article and also within Barnabas's book. And at the end of the article, there's a very interesting thing about what do we do? And she dismisses, Elisa dismisses, correct me if I'm wrong, either the sense of the tabula rasa, which is a kind of classic architectural thing to do. You know, it's all going wrong, so we're going to start again, and we're such geniuses that we can create the world afresh, or else a sort of a complete utopian rupture that we just dream of new worlds. And both of those, and this is something that we're doing in some of our work, through what we're doing is writing a series of pamphlets which set out, and so this is one of them about futures, written on behalf of Mould by Becca Volker. And so this is sort of one, just to get a sense of continuity between all of our works. The question remains as to how designers and co-designers might move into these futures in a manner that does not replicate the tropes of the status quo, but also in a way that does not invent unbounded fictions. And so I think the question of these futures is something maybe we're all bringing up and maybe we should talk about afterwards. And the big question is what to do next. That it's obvious that we need to move into a non-extractivist set of paradigms, a set of regenerative paradigms, one which escapes the modernist impulse to just see the world as a set of problems that can then be solved. So this sense of the solutionist paradigm needs to be overcome, but also to talk about the world in a sense full of care. But the main thing that we really need to talk about is what produced these conditions that are now facing us in this crisis. And the sticking point in all of these arguments is what do we do with capital? What do we do with capitalism? Where do we position ourselves in relation to capitalism? So if I read the beginning of the extraction pamphlet written by Anthony, who's in the audience, extractivist practices shape spaces and lives through colonial, capitalist, and exploitative ideologies that can be summarized as extractivism. Extractivism is the logic of fossil-fueled capitalism, and capitalism requires it as well as the inequality it produces. So within all these projects, we have to address head-on what we mean and how we face the violence of capitalism. And how do we, if we're going to create the post-carbon form, how do we create the post-carbon form within the current structures and strictures of capitalism in a way that escapes those structures and strictures. I think that it's too easy to just talk about the end of capitalism. I think that's a reductive, solutionist and idealist position to take. And there's a Sarah's also doing with Michael a set of podcasts, and there's a really beautiful podcast with Kate Rayworth, where they're positioning the work of the regenerative designer within the work of the regenerative economist. And if you put those two together, then I think that we are onto something quite important. And in the project, our provisional way of looking forwards is, rather than a tabula rasa or an unbounded fiction, is to try to gather examples of practices which are there at the moment, which in their own way are flourishing in the face of capitalism, sometimes explicitly critical, sometimes working with different value systems, sometimes engaging with alternative economies, and so on and so forth. But using these little moments of kind of flourishing as a lever to open up the gaps in the strictures of capitalism. And what we're doing is collecting these and then trying to see if their potential could be released by analyzing them, and to see what the barriers to them are, but also to see that if one could position them in a wider context, whether these other forms of practice could flourish. And we're going to do that also through scenario building. And just to end, I think the most important thing in rooms like this, or rooms around the world, is to be generous. We have to be generous of each other's, to accept our own kind of frailties, and also to kind of accept a multiplicity of approaches, from Sarah's to Elisa's to even ours. And I just want to end in the spirit of today. So these are the pamphlets which you can download. This is another thing, which is to be solidarity, both with us as humans, but with the non-humans as well. And to say that actually places like this school or St. Martin's or Yale are the places in which we do talk about imagination, but not necessarily in an unfettered way. But just to end also with the importance of acting. So this is my brother, who is one of the 80 people who shut the country down by sitting on a motorway and will inevitably be in prison fairly shortly. And Nick, when he goes back to his university where he's a professor of opera and is challenged, he's still got his job because he hasn't been put in jail yet, is challenged, he always comes up with this quote, which I think is a really important quote. And it's a quote which, in institutions like this, which are privileged, that students and staff are in a position of huge privilege because we have the luxury of being able to begin to know. But then we also have, in some way, as going to be celebrated on the terrace out there, the duty to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, Sarah, and Elisa. My mind is kind of throbbing. I don't know about anybody else's, but I think that what you've all three of you have said has really resonated with some important discussions that we're having in our school at the moment about how to build climate action into our curricula and into our teaching and learning practices. Just as a little bit of an insight, we had a workshop on Wednesday, and the words that staff were coming up with about what the values that should lie at the center of our curriculum are words like co-creation, collectivity, collaboration, equality. Capitalism was also there, and criticality. So we think we're getting there, and it's events like this that really inspire me to think that we're actually in the right direction. So thank you so much to all three of you. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I mean, I have questions, but I'd rather that the audience got involved at this stage. Would somebody like to get going? Ro, would you like to get a question going? We'll have to give you the microphone. Okay.
Hello, thank you to all three speakers. My question is kind of leading because it leads into the activity that we're going to be doing next. But I wondered if any of the speakers wanted to talk about what Jeremy was calling critters. Sarah, you talk about personhood, environmental personhood. But how should we be thinking about the planets in between, rather than kind of discard them and us? How else should we be thinking about it?
Would anybody like to respond to that?
I'd be happy to. Thanks. Is it Ro?
Yes.
Thanks so much for that question. I mean, that's I only had time today to go into a tiny fraction of the book, but really up front and center is the idea of shifting from a paradigm of dominion over nature, as Jeremy referenced, to thinking about ourselves as designing as a part of nature. And we're very influenced by thinkers like Freya Matthews, the environmental philosopher, who talks about deeper principles of biomimicry that treat nature as a co-agent, essentially, for the work that we produce. And are, of course, also, I think, Elisa, when you were talking about looking back, I also think we need to look back on a much deeper timeline as well, and not in a romantic way or an othering way, but actually, if you do that deeper research, I think if you're following the co-creative model of curiosity and criticality that Lindsay's and her colleagues are setting up, part of that is interdisciplinary discourse, and that's something that was an essential driving force for Flourish. It was trying to bring, rather than referring to Deleuze again, or like they're going to be standard folks who get brought into built environment critical discourse so much. And Michael and I felt that there are a lot of amazing thinkers, both practitioners and more philosophers, theorists, whose work has so much to add to this. And that includes those scholars who are looking very deeply into deeper human stories about that interconnection that helps us understand, if you look at a deeper ethnosphere, that it's only so recently actually that we have seen ourselves as divorced from nature, and we have seen the rest of nature as others. And there's scholars like James Agude, who we interview on our podcast, Flourish Systems Change, who looks at all of these deep human traditions and narratives of relationality with the rest of nature. And I think that once we do that, as soon as we start to engage with what other scholars, practitioners are doing from outside of the built environment per se, that's when I start to feel an immense amount of hope. It's almost like we have this disconnection that's driving us down this deep, dark tunnel of all of the dystopian outputs I see now when if I'm a guest critic at schools. And instead, if we can broaden our reference points, looking at a deeper frame of history and a broader geography, and doing the work or connecting with those scholars who are doing the work of unearthing all of this multiplicity of narratives of how we can think about the world and how we can be in the world, that there's immense richness to be found in many ways, but especially in response to your question, Ro, of that, like thinking about a deeper relational interaction with non-human life forms, and even inanimate objects as well.
I think that's absolutely right. At a kind of human level, it's a bit of a mind twist because we're so set into a city with no nature, as it were. To actually get that empathy is difficult. I think the real issue for me, which you talk about in the book, but I think is also very challenging, is the whole history of architecture is a history in opposition to nature, almost by kind of definition it is, and that's what we do. We extract from the world, we take stuff out of the world, we appropriate it, and we turn it into a thing called carbon form. And in that, we are distanced from nature. So that very act of making is an act of distancing. And therefore, if you're looking at what architecture after architecture might be, one has to, and it's a question I quite like to ask Elise, which is, will you persist with the use of the term form with all its ramifications, or does form take on completely different resonances in a post-carbon world? Because if architecture is still bound to the production of form, I don't think we can escape the carbon world, and therefore it probably needs a new definition of what we mean by form, whether form is now expressed as a set of contingent social and spatial relationships in which there are pieces of stuff. There will be pieces of stuff in there, or whether, anyway, I'd like to ask that question of you actually, because I'm interested about, can you move beyond the notion of form as the sole kind of output of what an architect does?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if I would say that form is the sole output, but I would say it's sort of the realm in which we directly are intervening and manipulating. And I do agree that there is something about the way that we have been thinking about form that will have to shift. But I think that even within our current modes of practice and current ways of knowing, let's say, if we already expand a form, then I think it's not necessarily a binary. We used to be very form focused and now we won't. Because I think of them as really about patterns and relationships and things that become legible in space. And everything has a form, right? Ecosystems have a form, natural features have form and spatial dispositions, etc. And I think that as architects, part of our training is simply to learn how to see those things. And I don't know if that will no longer be applicable as we shift. I think it still will be applicable. And to me, the lesson of carbon form has not been so much, I think, well, I should backtrack and say, I think that in part, the word form has been charged by the architectural discourse of the latter half of the 20th century, where form was treated as something disciplinary, sort of introverted, very specific to sort of geometric play, and perhaps unrelated to what's happening in terms of social processes or economic processes or politics. But actually a book that was influential for me and that actually really resonated kind of my early thinking on this as I was trying to kind of grapple with these concepts is a book by Caroline Levine called Forms. And she's actually writing from literary theory. But her trajectory actually was similar to mine. I read a lot about it in grad school and was just really thinking about like his grappling with the relationship between space and power. And she also, a lot of Foucault, her education, form is about if we think about power as an act of positioning, then form and power are always related. Within society, we can understand all of these ways between people and places, etc. And so if form is really about how we position things in space and how we distribute them, then it's always about power, right? And so form and the way we configure our built environment always has certain affordances, and form always allows and disallows certain things. And so for me, the question is away from form. It's a question for me of like, how do we manipulate space to open up cracks in the system? Other kinds of activities begin to take place and other relationships to emerge. And I think sometimes we don't recognize enough how much the built environment, my life in New York, I can live a handful of ways because of the way that my apartment building is, right? I can't have a garden there. There are all these things that I can't do. And it's because of the way that not only my building is configured, but the apartment building relative to the rest of the city, and the city relative to the life to take place in the city. So those are all questions of some form. And for me, the question is not turning away from that, but that ability.
We seem to be losing Elisa. Shall we carry on? Can you hear me, Sarah, with this mic? Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
You know, I mean, while we try and get Elisa back, I've recently been reading the German degrowth writer, whose name is Nicholas Pesch, who says one of the problems with the discourse on sustainability is we fetishize the object. And we think that objects can be sustainable. He says they can't. The only thing that can be sustainable are lifestyles, which kind of is saying a similar thing to what I think Jeremy and Elisa are saying, that form itself is not inherently anything. It's how it relates to the wider structures of society, including how life is conducted within them, that actually matters and that form can shape.
But the issue is, and picking up something Sarah was saying earlier about competition, the issue is that the whole of architectural culture, and particularly architectural education, are addicted to the production of things that look like something, that the identity of the student is expressed in their portfolio. And the more spectacular that portfolio is, the better the student is meant to be. It doesn't matter if the student is a fascist, as long as what they're producing is absolutely wonderful, because you can't, it's very difficult to assess values. It's very easy to assess spectacle. And this is something that I think Sarah was talking about, but it also presents a huge challenge to architects, because architects also define themselves through their buildings, what they look like. And therefore, if you take what Elisa's kind of subtle reworking of notions of form, which I completely agree with, or you take the Nicholas Pesch thing, then what is left for architects is very, very different, because it's a much more humble version of what we produce, but a much more powerful version, because we can't identify it. It has no identity as a kind of visual asset. And I think that's a huge issue. I mean, when the RIBA came to Sheffield, when I was head of Sheffield, and we were doing live projects, which are generally failures, because that's what happens with live projects, and they didn't look like anything at all, they gave us a real kicking. They said, well, where's the stuff? And I said, but the stuff is in these live projects, because that's how the students are learning. They're learning through failure, they're learning through collaboration, they're learning through co-design with their live clients and so on and so forth. But because there was no spectacle at the end of their portfolios, the RIBA, they kept it going, but it was a difficult journey. And I think that that's going to be the same, particularly in the elite schools, in which the students' products are a form of marketing to get the next set of students to be exploited, to produce the same set of even more spectacles. And so how will schools of architecture be able to market themselves if what they're producing are ethical values? It's really difficult because they don't look like anything.
I am so glad
Jeremy.
you raised
Sarah.
that point. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you raised that point, Jeremy, because listening earlier, I think it's really important we address the aesthetic issue head on, and think about how we properly, as educators, how you might engage with that and how you might construct a broader set of values, or a value, Lindsay, you were talking about you and your colleagues assembling new values. How do those values map onto systems of evaluation? And I think that needs a tremendous amount of critical thought. And I'd also love to hear Elisa's thought about the role of representation of these spaces in imagining our way forward and in communicating them. I think, Jeremy, I had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to one of your earlier remarks when you were kind of saying, but that's how architecture has always been, it's always been extractive. And I think that part of that betrays perhaps a slightly delimited view of what we are allowing into the canon of architecture, which I was a bit surprised hearing from you of all people. And I think similarly, when people talk about being so depressed about the trajectory of things, when I visit, I had a year where I got to visit all of these eco-villages that were in post-industrial cities. So they were retrofitting this inherited carbon form with different structures of funding, different structures of mutual aid. You know, there was physical interventions, and there were the other aspects of form that Elisa has referenced. And I felt so much hope in practice there, and it was completely scalable, or, you know, like translatable. But they're never going to get published in the zine, right? They're never going to have a Pinterest page about them. And I think that you know, leading institutions like those that you're involved in can play a huge role in actively thinking, how do we develop new evaluative frameworks, and how does that relate to the mediatization of our students' work? And I think that that's a really distinct and potentially impactful area of intervention that I haven't heard that much discussion about yet.
Thank you, Sarah. I think there are a few more questions from the floor, which I'd like to go to give people a chance to ask them, because we probably need to close in about 10 minutes, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm completely blown away, actually. My name's Jim Engel. I studied at this institution some time ago, and I practice as a designer, spatial designer, architect. I'm a little bit confused, though, about a couple of things being talked about. Maybe it's just I don't understand the language. So what is a post-carbon design? And what is the difference between that and a carbon positive design, which is something that I champion? And in championing things like carbon positive design, I also champion search engines such as Ecosia rather than Google as a very good example of something that can move, doesn't solve everything, but can move towards a carbon positive solution. So I just would like to understand the language that's being used today, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if
Maybe I can clarify.
Are there any more questions before we get an answer to that one? I'll just take one more question and then we'll have answers. Okay.
I think Elise should do the post-carbon, carbon positive.
Yeah. I see that I'm responsible for that confusion.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting. So I have two questions. One is both for Jeremy and Sarah, when you speak about this humble architecture. So architecture has been an art since, the prehistoric buildings throughout. Are we almost thinking that this art is going to disappear and become more an humble new form? So this is a provocative question. And the other question is more, Jeremy, you spoke about this lever, these projects open up. Sarah, you mentioned the eco-villages. I just would like to ask if there is any other example of these projects. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I mean, we have one question for each of our speakers, so that's a good way to try and conclude. Elisa, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for that question. And it is important to clarify. And actually, usually when I give a talk on carbon form, I give a little bit more context as to what I'm referring to with carbon, but I wanted to be very brief today. But essentially, for me, the idea of carbon form is not to talk about carbon footprint. They are not the same in terms of the terminology that I'm trying to use here. And the idea of carbon form is simply to say that there is spatial expression to an energy paradigm that becomes legible in space. So it's not about the building's carbon footprint. It's not necessarily about operational carbon or even embodied carbon. It's more to say that once we shift into a fossil fuel paradigm and our society and all of our productive activities injected with this dense and abundant energy, our concepts of space begin to change. So, one example that I like to use is, looking at, for example, there's a palazzo in Rome that has a ramp for carriages in the center of it, the Palazzo Barberini. And if you compare the section of that building and the proportions and the ramp and the sort of scale of it and how it moves past the building, you see that space is all calibrated for a particular way of moving through space, which relies on human and animal bodies basically pulling things. If you compare that to the Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, you see the building is registering the turning radius of the car, right? So, you know, that's an example where the Villa Savoye is perhaps not the most energy intensive building, although perhaps also not the most efficient, but, you know, of the buildings we have, it's not sort of this example of like wildly exorbitant energy use, but nonetheless, through its spatial configuration is kind of registering that turning radius of the car. So that's an example at the architectural scale, but at the urban scale, I think we also begin to have these spatial concepts in the early 20th century about this kind of infinite territorial expansion. Our concepts of the urban grid start to change. The way in which we present space, kind of like infinite aerial perspectives, which are classic in modernism and which we continue to use today. These are ways of thinking about space. And so I think that's an important aspect of carbon form, as well as the specific typologies that emerge at a particular time, right? Such as airports and skyscrapers and things like this that are I think, examples of carbon form, not only because of their energy consumption, but because of how they themselves also propagate an energy intensive way of life and are dependent on intensive energy to simply come into existence. So I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Just to come into, I think that, I mean, carbon positive buildings, absolutely. I'm obsessed by building science. We just retrofitted our thing. I know, you know, and if I escape from this bloody country and build a house in France, it would be carbon positive. So, but when we're not going to solve the crisis of climate one straw building at a time, as it were. And therefore, all of these things need to be placed into a kind of understanding of the relationship between the technical, the cultural, as both Elise and Sarah are talking about, so that the carbon, and I think that there is still the hope, which is a very modern hope, that we are going to solve the climate crisis one straw building at a time. But it needs clearly systemic change as well.
I would love to try to respond to the question about, I'm absolutely not advocating, and Michael, if he were with us, I think would absolutely, we're not advocating for the disappearance of architecture as an art. In fact, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for an absolute flourishing and like complete renovation and reimagining of architecture, both in terms of the role of the architecture, how we design our relationship to form, our relationship to aesthetics, how the aesthetics relate to values. And I completely agree, Jeremy, we're not gonna solve this one carbon bale house at a time, no matter how amazing they might be. But I think that I do see potential in particular buildings or design studios who have a different approach to materiality and are thinking about the materials almost as co-creators of the form together with them. And so I'm holding in mind two very different examples, different geographies, different contexts. One is the work of Ibuku in Bali, where they've really, building on traditional Indonesian building technologies, are now developing these new gorgeous forms of architecture, beautifully expressive artistic forms of architecture, but that are essentially co-designed with the individual pieces of bamboo that they have available on site. So the constituent pieces then become the inputs that influence what the final formal output is, and in a quite different way. Super U Studio, you know, just a quick train ride away from where I am right now, in Blue City in Rotterdam, have been trying to revolutionize the building kind of circular economy approach, to not say, I'm going to design and then I'm going to go and try to find the reused materials to build into my building, but rather I'm going to understand in my given, in my given context, what waste materials are at my disposal, and then I use those as a point of genesis for my design. So I think both of those approaches are opening up very different ways of thinking about the art of architecture that aren't about coming up with a form and then finding the materiality to deliver that and then trying to make it carbon positive, but rather understanding what resources are immediately available and using those to co-generate what form results. And I think both of those approaches are, I can imagine, being translatable and scalable.
Thanks, Sarah. I do see that our head of department, Harry Charrington, has his hand up from the online audience. Harry, are you there? And I think that will probably have to be our last question. Harry, are you there?
Hi, Lindsay. Yes, I am.
Good.
Sorry, I would be with you today, but I've got COVID, actually at Jeremy's old school. I was at Sheffield last week. But going further north, just wanted to make a comment related to where I used to practice in Newcastle in the north of England, and where I began teaching actually as well. And I think there's quite a critical thing here related to this conversation about big schools. I'm not really that interested in the big schools because the big schools keep doing the same things. And one of the things I learned, having studied at probably what some people might think is a big school up in Newcastle, was that provincialism is also a place of freedom, away from the obsessions of the big schools. And maybe Jeremy Sheffield would, I don't know how it would feel about me including them in that periphery of, what Gideon would have called the creative periphery, probably. But two things I would say. In this need for generosity, I think there's a really big need not to generalize. And when we talk about, architecture this, architecture that, it's fairly abstract and it's fairly wrong. And a lot of what people have talked about today has been going on of good practice has been going on for a very, very long time. And it's going on in multifarious ways. And it goes back to that old thing of, the most important thing about being an architect is choosing your client. And it's about the relationships that you take your agency into. And it's the relationships that you try and engender through your agency as well. So I mean, again, I'm probably generalizing myself now, but that would be something I want to say about, I think there's a lot of it going on, but I think there is also a freedom in a lot of architectural education that is leading to some quite positive solutions. Jeremy doesn't like that word, but anyway, it's come out of my mouth, forgive me. But I think there's a lot going on that's a little bit more hopeful. And I do agree that there's a really important thing for schools like ours in Westminster, for all its incredible inclusion and diversity, unrecognizable from some of the other big schools in London, that we aren't obsessed by novelty. We lose that obsession with novelty, and that we really do continue and encourage, if we're not doing it enough, the choosing of clients very carefully, the setting of projects into the kind of complexity with which we need to operate if we're going to come up with a carbon positive future. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, I would love to do a last round of our speakers, to sort of 2 minutes each. If there's time, is there time, Daniel and Teo? Yeah?
23 pounds.
I think 2 minutes each, and then I'm going to hand over to Ro to introduce the next part of this event, which unfortunately our online participants will not be able to participate in. But final round, Jeremy, would you like to start? And then we'll go to Elisa and to Sarah.
Oh, I hate closing words because you can't nail things. I think it's just about what I said at the beginning, that who was it who said climate is total? You said that, didn't you, at the beginning? And I believe that. I think that climate is total, and therefore we need to be viewing all our discussions through the lens of climate, and that anything else is not kind of secondary, because everything else needs to contribute to that kind of to that lens. So I would just urge people to shift from a kind of a unit called sustainable design into climate as total.
Thanks, Jeremy. Elisa? We can't hear you.
I agree that closing remarks are always difficult, but oh, how about now? No, still no.
Good, good. No, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
We
Yeah,
can't
sorry,
hear
there's
you
a delay.
again.
So
Yeah.
I was just saying that I agree that closing, but just to say that I'm very grateful. Uh-oh. Now?
Good,
I
we
think
can
it's
hear
just
you.
my connection. Okay. I'll just say thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. These kinds of conversations are extremely important for the growth of these ideas and the dissemination of them. So I hope we can continue to speak and discuss and perhaps collaborate in some form. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Sarah.
Thank you also. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. Wish I could join you for the action on the terrace afterwards. Yes, I completely agree that climate should be our top priority, as long as we are making very, very clear that our definition of climate is that Lindsay used. I think there's a huge, huge risk of carbon reductionism. And I think that's why it was so important we took the time to differentiate what Elisa meant by carbon form, that she's looking at how it's situated with an entire extractive and industrial system. It's not purely about the individualized, productized carbon footprint of an individual building, which is still clients love that way of thinking about carbon, because that doesn't make them take real responsibility for what their larger companies are doing. They just they just commission a nice net zero maybe building. So I think, yes, climate can be our top priority, as long as we are thinking about it in all of its facets, including the massive implications of justice. And I'm so happy, Lindsay, that you and your colleagues are pairing redistribution, or I would probably call it justice, with regeneration, so that we make sure that those two are fully braided together.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jeremy. Very stimulating, and I'm sure it will carry on for the rest of the afternoon. Ro, would you like to come up and explain the next part of the session? And we'll allow you to listen to what you're going to miss if you'd like to.
Thanks, Lindsay. You're probably fine, you're not in there. Well, the second part of this event, because the event is part of the London Festival of Architecture, where the theme is ACT. And it's very easy to listen in a room and kind of go away and think about it. But actually, I just wanted to kind of dedicate this to Jeremy's brother and his statement about those that have the privilege to know have a duty to act. So none of you are getting away with doing nothing. We're all going to go out onto the terrace. And I spoke a lot with Lindsay and Diana, and we were thinking about like, what could the action be? And we thought that as a sort of way to start this, we should just try and think, how do we shift how we think about the planet? And the one way I think to do that is to acknowledge that we should think of the planet in the same way as we think of ourselves, and to give the planet personhoods, hence my question. The idea of environmental personhood has been part of Indigenous thinking for millennia, and more recently has been adopted as a way to give the natural environment legal rights. An example is 2017, when in New Zealand, and I apologize my pronunciation, the Whanganui River was given personhood. And the idea has since taken traction in India, Colombia, Bangladesh, Australia, all places with indigenous populations, with rivers, mountains, and even a national park given personhood. So the action today that you all have to take part in is to invite you all to write a postcard to a part of the planet that you believe deserves personhood. It might be a place that you love, it might be an entity such as a river and a mountain, an organism like a favorite tree, or even something you see as missing, such as say a common weed that used to be abundant and you suddenly sort of realized it's not there. The personhood that you give it is acknowledged simply because they become the recipient of your postcards. Now, this might sound like a bit of a weird idea, and there's been several metaphorical jumps. And Sarah, I've really enjoyed in your book how you discuss language and use of metaphor and the use of myths. But the idea of the postcard, and this is the jump you guys will have to take with us, is that the third part of the afternoon is a tea party to commemorate Elspeth McKellen, who was one of the first female women to study architecture at the Regent Street Poly, which is the institution that became the University of Westminster today. Now, she took classes at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, but because she was a woman, she could take the classes, but she couldn't qualify as an architect, and nor could she vote. Frustrated with her situation, her lack of personhood, her lack of voice, and her lack of equal rights, she joined the suffragettes. And in 1919, along with Daisy Solomon, had herself posted as a human letter to 10 Downing Street, which cost 3p on the stamp, as a means of getting an audience with the then Prime Minister Asquith. When the women were returned unread, that was of course disappointing, but it had the effect of getting a lot of publicity and allowed the women's voices to be heard. Elspeth was awarded a tea service by Queen Alexandra for her efforts to women's suffrage. So inspired by this story, we borrowed the idea of posting someone or something as an act of protest. And the action works through the identification of your recipient. So if you go out onto the terrace now, you will there's lots of assistants out to guide you on your way. Do you want to just... You will find blank postcards and Sharpies waiting for you. Your message is completely up to you. It might be a message from you, or it might be, you might express something that your recipient you think would like to say. And once you find your written your postcards, could you find Myrna? Myrna, are you here? So here's Myrna, and she will take your picture holding your postcard in front of a banner that's out there. And then it can be pinned up on a wooden pavilion. And again, there'll be people helping if you don't exactly understand what to do, there's lots of guides out there. And all of this can be done in the manner of a true suffragette. So it comes with a cup of tea and a sandwich, and they're next to the postcards. The final bit of this slight pantomime is around 4 o'clock. In order to remember and commemorate Elspeth's remarkable forgotten history, we're officially naming what we at the moment call, that terrace thing on the south side. We're going to call it the Elspeth McKellen Terrace. And in honor of this event, Claire Toomey, who's our professor of ceramics, who she's actually talking in another conference in my office, but she's going to come whizzing down, has designed a ceramic installation which will go out on the terrace, and it's a blueprint for us all, which we'll see the banner being presented and opened. It's on the tall wall by the fire escape, and there'll be a short presentation from Claire and our Vice Chancellor, Peter Bonfield, and then hopefully there's some wine. So I hope no one's going to try and sneak out and that we end up with a whole pile of postcards. Thank you.